"Who mended this harness?" the rancher demanded, and every man in the room went quiet. The Holt Creek Supply Depot sat at the edge of the world, or near enough to it. It occupied a wide, low building at the junction of two wagon trails, one heading north into the teeth of Wyoming's high country, the other angling southeast toward the railroad towns, where civilization kept its offices. Dust was the permanent condition of the place, and cold was the seasonal one. In October, it came early and mean, sliding down off the mountains like something with a grudge. Cole Whitaker rode in on a Thursday. He came from the direction of his grazing land, which stretched 40 miles to the northwest, and which he had worked for 11 years without a single day he could honestly call easy. He was a lean, deliberate man of 38, the kind whose face had been weathered into something resembling patience whether he felt it or not. He had a rancher's hands, scarred, wide-knuckled, capable, and a rancher's habit of economy, of saying precisely what needed saying and nothing more. His horse needed a shoe, his lead rope had frayed through, and his prize-cutting harness, the one he'd paid good money for in Cheyenne 3 years prior, had cracked along the left brace strap in a way that made it unreliable, which in his line of work was the same as useless. The depot's main room was crowded for mid-morning. 3 trail hands were arguing over a bill near the counter. A pair of homesteaders in clean clothes that hadn't been clean long stood by the stove, trying to look as though they weren't cold. Behind the counter, Raymond Pruitt, the depot's owner, a man built like a rain barrel and half as smart, was attempting to reconcile a ledger with the focused distress of someone who had never been naturally suited to numbers. Cole set the harness on the counter. "Brace straps crack through," he said. "Left side. I need it sound before I ride back." Pruitt looked at the harness the way a man looks at a problem he intends to delegate. "I'll have one of the boys take a look." Cole nodded and stepped back to wait. He was good at waiting. He'd had a great deal of practice. It was while he was waiting, settled on a bench near the front window with a cup of coffee that was mostly just hot, that he first noticed her. She came through a side door, the one that led to the back room where the tack and tools were stored. She was carrying a length of bridle leather over one shoulder and a wooden case of awls in her other hand, moving with the focused quickness of someone who had a great deal to do and was accustomed to doing it without anyone's assistance or acknowledgement. She was young, 22, perhaps 23, with dark copper-red hair pinned up loosely and a dusting of freckles across a face that would have been called pretty in any room, though no one in this particular room appeared to notice. She wore a canvas work apron over a blue-gray dress, and there was a small smudge of beeswax on her left cheek that she hadn't had occasion to notice. She set her case down behind the counter, exchanged 2 words with Pruitt that Cole couldn't hear from across the room, then picked up Cole's cracked harness from the counter and carried it without ceremony through the side door and back into the workroom. Cole watched her go. He watched the way the 3 arguing trail hands simply rearranged themselves around her passage without looking at her, the way water flows around a stone without thinking about it. He watched Pruitt return to his ledger without acknowledging her departure. He drank his coffee, and he thought about that. An hour passed, maybe a little more. He was on his second cup, the cold outside having intensified his appreciation for anything warm, when Pruitt called over to him. "Whitaker, harness is done." Cole set down his cup and walked to the counter. The harness was there, laid out flat. He picked it up and looked at the left brace strap. He turned it over in his hand slowly. Then he turned it over again. The crack was gone, not patched over, not covered, but properly repaired. The leather pieced with a cut so clean and a seam so precise that if he hadn't known exactly where to look, he would have doubted the damage had ever been there. The stitching was waxed linen, pulled tight with consistent tension all the way through. The brace itself had been conditioned and worked until it was supple again, and the buckle at the end had been reset into a new leather loop that would hold for years. Cole had been working with horses and tack since he was 12 years old. He had seen a lot of harness repair in his life. He had never seen this quality of work come out of a depot back room in under an hour. He looked at Pruitt. "Who did this?" Pruitt glanced up from his ledger. "My girl," he said, the way a man might refer to a useful piece of equipment. "She handles the leather work." "Your girl," Cole repeated. My niece, Nora. Pruitt had already looked back down. She's got a knack for it. Cole set the harness back on the counter and looked at the side door for a moment. Then he picked the harness up again, turned it once more in his hands, and said, to no one in particular, I'd like to speak with her. Pruitt looked up again with mild surprise, as if a piece of furniture had expressed an opinion. She's working. I won't take long. There was a beat of silence, and then Pruitt shrugged the shrug of a man who considers the matter beneath his sustained attention. Suit yourself. Cole walked to the side door and knocked twice on the frame before pushing it open. The workroom was narrow and well lit, 2 oil lamps supplementing the gray light from a single high window. Every surface was organized pegs for tools, shelves for supplies, a long table in the center worn smooth from years of use. The smell was of leather and beeswax, and the faint ghost of wood smoke. She was already working on something else, a bridle with a cracked cheekpiece, her head bent and her hands moving with quiet efficiency. She looked up when he came in, and her expression shifted not to alarm exactly, but to the careful blankness of someone who had learned to read rooms and was taking his measure. You did the harness, Cole said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Her voice was level. She had clear gray eyes and a steady way of meeting his gaze that suggested she was not easily rattled. Where'd you learn to work leather like that? Something moved across her face, briefly. My father, she said. He was a saddle maker. In Laramie. Cole turned the harness over in his hands again, even though he'd already studied it thoroughly. He just wanted something to do with his hands while he figured out what he was trying to say. I've taken tack to the best shop in Casper, he said. The man there charges 3 times what Pruitt charged me, and he doesn't work this clean. Nora Whitfield set down the bridle. She looked at him with the expression of someone who was not quite sure what to do with a sincere compliment. Not because she was unused to compliments of the ordinary kind, but because a compliment about her work was a different and rarer creature entirely. Thank you, she said carefully. I'm not being polite, Cole said. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. Her chin lifted, almost imperceptibly. He had the sense that something behind her eyes had just paid closer attention. He left without asking any further questions, paid Pruitt for the repair, and rode back to his ranch with the harness in better condition than it had been in 2 years. He told himself the matter was closed. It was not closed. He came back the following week with a set of hobbles that needed stitching. He could have stitched them himself. He was aware of this. She was in the workroom again. She took the hobbles, looked them over, and told him they'd be ready by afternoon. She did not ask why a man who clearly knew his way around tack couldn't stitch a set of hobbles himself. He appreciated that. He'd had enough conversations where people asked the obvious question. While he waited, he stayed in the main room. He watched her work from across the half-open door, the same way he'd watched the first time without quite meaning to. He noticed the things he hadn't noticed before, or had noticed and set aside. The way she organized Pruitt's chaotic supply shelves without being asked. The way she handled the 2 delivery men who came through before noon, negotiating pricing with the calm of someone who had spent considerable time learning exactly what things cost and what they were worth. The way Pruitt presented her work as his own expertise when talking to customers without a single acknowledgement in her direction. He noticed the way her hands were capable and precise, but also marked small scars on the left thumb and forefinger, the kind that came from years of working with sharp tools, not the marks of carelessness. The marks of experience. He thought about what it was like to do excellent work in a room full of people who looked right through it. He came back the week after that. The week after that. Also, by the 5th visit, he had run out of things to bring for repair that he couldn't reasonably be expected to have repaired himself, and he had resorted to purchasing supplies, a tin of dubbing, a set of rings, a length of cotton rope that he didn't strictly need. Nora accepted his money without comment, but on his way out, she said, without looking up from her work, the Morgan mare, left foreleg. Cole paused at the door. What about her? She's landing short on the left. Has been since you rode in today. Nora glanced up just briefly. Could be the shoe's working loose, or she favors it. Either way, I'd check it before you push her on the return. My. He had not mentioned the mare. He hadn't said a word about her. He went out and checked the left shoe. It was loose. Not dangerously, but enough. He stood in the cold for a long moment, looking at the mare and then back at the depot door. Then he walked back in, past the trail hands and the homesteaders and Raymond Pruitt and his ledger, and he leaned through the workroom door. You noticed that while I was tying off, he said. Nora didn't look up. She was subtle about it. Most people would have missed it. You didn't. No. A beat of quiet. I grew up watching horses. I know what favoring looks like. He stood in the doorway for another moment, which was longer than the situation technically required. What's your name? He said. Your full name. She looked up. Nora Whitfield, she said. My mother's people are Harlan Whitfields out of Colorado. My father was James Whitfield, Laramie. He died 4 years ago. She said it without excessive weight, the way you state a fact that has long since finished being new. Cole Whitaker, he said. Northwest Range, 40 miles up, 11 years. She nodded once, as though filing it. Your Uncle Pruitt. He hesitated. Does he pay you fair? Her hands stilled on the leather for just a fraction of a second. Then they resumed. He gives me room and board, she said, which was not an answer to the question he had asked. He nodded slowly and went to get his horse's shoe seen to. The trouble came 6 weeks later, in the first hard weeks of December, when the cold had locked itself into the landscape like something intending to stay permanently. Cole was in the depot loading supplies when he heard Pruitt talking to a man he didn't recognize, a well-dressed man with a Denver banker's air about him, the kind of clean hands that come from a lifetime of handling other people's problems from a distance. They were in the far corner, speaking in the half-lowered voices of men finalizing something they'd already decided. She'll need to be cleared out by the 1st of January, the Denver man said. Whoever's in the back room. Pruitt waved a hand. She's just my niece. She's been helping out. She'll manage. I'm sure she will. The Denver man had the tone of a man who was certain that other people's problems would, indeed, manage themselves. The new operation won't need a workroom. We're turning that space into a dry goods extension. Cole set down the tin of grease he'd been holding. He did it carefully, because the alternative was setting it down in a way that would have drawn attention. He finished loading his supplies. He waited until the Denver man had taken his leave and Pruitt had gone back to his ledger. Then he walked to the workroom door. Nora was at her bench. She was working on a complex piece, a full western saddle with a torn skirt, her head bent, hands moving with the concentrated focus that was, he had come to understand, simply her natural state. She did not look like someone who knew what had just been decided about her. Cole stood in the doorway for a moment. Pruitt's selling the depot, he said. Her hands paused. A small pause, quickly controlled. She didn't look up immediately. When she did, her face was composed in that way it had the way of a person who has learned that composure is the only practical response to bad news. I see, she said. New owners, Denver operation. They're turning your workroom into dry goods. He kept his voice flat, because he thought she'd want it that way. January 1st, a silence. Nora looked down at the saddle. She set her tools down carefully, one by one, the way you do when your hands need something deliberate to do. How long have you known this was coming? Cole asked. I didn't, she said simply, but I'm not surprised. That was the thing that tightened something in his chest. Not anger, though anger was there too, but the particular weight of recognizing that this was not something that had happened to her suddenly. It was something she had always been braced for. The rug being pulled. The floor disappearing. The reliable understanding that things good enough to matter would eventually be taken. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I need a tack manager. She looked at him. My operation runs 40 head of working horses, he said, keeping his voice the same, careful, flat as before. Every one of them needs regular attention. I've got a tack room I built myself. It's organized well enough. But I'm a rancher, not a leather man, and the difference shows in the equipment. He paused. The job has a wage. It's fair. Better than fair. And there's a room. He said it plainly. Off the main house. Private. with a window that faces the mountain. Nora Whitfield looked at him for a long time. It was the kind of look that was doing several things at once. She was calculating something. She was measuring something. And underneath both of those things, she was deciding something. Though what exactly, he couldn't read. "My father's tools," she said finally. "The full set. They go with me, obviously," he said. Another silence. In the workroom, the lamps burned steady. The smell of leather and beeswax held in the cold air. "I have a horse," she said. "My own. She's boarded 2 doors down. I've got pasture." Nora picked up her awl from the table. She turned it over once in her fingers, a gesture he'd seen her make before, the unconscious habit of someone who thinks with their hands. Then she set it back down. "First of the month is December 15th, she said. "That's the next time Pruitt does inventory. He'll need me before then." "Mid-December," Cole said. "I can wait." Then she met his eyes with the same level, clear, gray gaze she'd had since the first day he walked into this workroom. "December 16th. He gave a single nod. He almost left. He was nearly at the door when he stopped, turned back, and said something that wasn't in his plan, and that surprised him somewhat as he was saying it. "He should have paid you," he said. "Pruitt. What you brought to this operation, he should have paid you for it. Every week, without being asked." Nora looked at him for a moment, with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. Then the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something in that direction, which on her face, he had learned, was the equivalent of a wide grin on anyone else. "I know that," she said quietly. "I've known that for 3 years." He rode back to his ranch in the December cold and spent the evening doing something he hadn't done in a long time, which was plan. He cleaned the tack room out from floor to ceiling. He built a new workbench along the south wall, solid and at the right height, which he determined by measuring against his own workbench in the barn and subtracting several inches. He put in a second oil lamp bracket above it. He organized the pegs and shelves the way he would have wanted them organized if organization had been his particular gift, which it was not, and then he reorganized them once more, the way he suspected someone with genuine expertise might want them instead. The room off the main house he'd mentioned, it had been a storage room for a while, and before that a guest room, during the years when he'd had people enough to need guest rooms. He cleared it. He put in a good iron stove that pulled warmth from the main house chimney. The window did face the mountains. He'd forgotten that it was a good window until he stood in the room at the right time of morning, and the light came through it in a way that made even storage boxes look dignified. He cut a proper shelf beside the window. He didn't know exactly what she'd want it for, but the room needed a shelf, and the gesture of building one seemed like the most honest thing he could do. Nora arrived on the morning of December 16th with her father's tool case in one hand and a saddle roll over one shoulder. Her horse, a sensible-looking bay mare, followed behind on a lead. That was the entirety of her possessions as far as Cole could tell. She walked into the tack room and was quiet for a moment, taking it in. She ran one hand along the new workbench. She examined the lamp bracket. She looked at the arrangement of pegs and shelves with the assessing eye of a professional reviewing work that is technically correct but perhaps not quite intuitive. "The awl pegs should be closer to the bench," she said. "About here," she indicated a spot. "I'll move them today," Cole said. She looked at him. Something in his lack of argument seemed to recalibrate her slightly. The winter passed in work. Nora's effect on the ranch's tack operation became evident with the same quiet thoroughness as everything else she did. Bridles that had been subtly off-fitting were rebuilt correctly. Saddles that had developed dangerous wear were repaired before they failed. The horses responded not dramatically, not in ways that made for good stories, but in the consistent daily reality of animals moving comfortably and working well. The ranch hands noticed. They didn't say much about it, because ranch hands on a cold December generally do not give speeches, but they noticed. Cole watched her from across distances that he seemed to be unconsciously adjusting over the course of the winter. It started as the length of the barn, then the length of the paddock fence. Then he found himself having conversations with her over the workbench about horses and leather that went on considerably longer than the logistical content required. She had opinions. She had observations. She had a dry, precise humor that appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. She knew things about horses that he hadn't known after 38 years of working with them, and she shared this knowledge with neither condescension nor performance, simply as fact. The way you hand someone a useful tool. She talked about her father, about his shop in Laramie, about the specific things he had taught her, about the years she had spent watching him work before he let her try, and then the years she'd spent being corrected until the corrections came less and less frequently, and finally, not at all. She talked about what it had been like to come to Pruitt's after, when the shop had to be sold to cover debts. She did not speak of it with bitterness, exactly, but she spoke of it with the precise understanding of someone who has counted up every cost and knows the exact arithmetic of what was lost. "He never once introduced me as the one who did the leather work," she said one evening, not looking up from the bridle in her hands. 3 years. Not once. Cole was on the other side of the workbench, working a stiff piece of harness oil into a brace that had dried out over the winter. "I know," he said. She glanced up. "You noticed that the first day." "I noticed it," he said. "Yes." Another of those small, precise silences. "Most people didn't," she said. "I know that too." Spring came in steps, the way it always did at this altitude, a tentative warmth followed by a week of cold, then 2 warm days, then cold again, as though the season was reconsidering its commitment. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, revealing the brown, matted grass that would turn green in another few weeks. The horses moved differently in the warming air, looser, more willing. Cole found her in the paddock one morning in early April, watching his best cutting horse work the fence line just for the pleasure of it. She had her arms resting on the top rail and her chin on her arms, and she was watching the horse the way you watch something that gives you uncomplicated happiness. He stood beside her and they watched together for a while without speaking. "I've been thinking," he said finally. "I know," she said. He turned to look at her. She was still watching the horse. "The tack room," she said, "is organized the way I'd organize my own. The workbench is at the right height. The lamp is exactly where I'd want it." She paused. Nobody builds a workbench to someone else's specifications unless they intend them to stay. Cole looked back at the horse. The animal was running the fence now, easy and smooth. "I built the shelf too," he said. "In the room. I noticed the shelf. I didn't know what for. I just thought." He stopped, started again. "I thought you should have one thing in your space that was built for you, without a reason." Nora turned her head and looked at him. The morning light was coming off the mountains at the angle that made everything look honest, and in that light her gray eyes were clear and steady and direct, the same as they had been the first day he walked into that workroom, and she looked up at him from the bridle she was mending. "Cole Whitaker," she said, "are you trying to say something?" He turned to face her. He had always been. Better with his hands than with his mouth. Better with action than with articulation. And he knew this about himself. But there were times when a man had to push past his own limitations and simply say the thing. "I'm saying," he said, "that this is yours. The room, the workbench, the shelf. All of it." He met her eyes. "And I am asking if you would consider making it yours permanently, not as my hired hand." A pause. "As my wife." The horse ran the fence again. The mountains stood where they'd always stood. The morning light held. Nora looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she reached over and picked up a small stone from the top rail she'd been using it as a marker and turned it over once in her fingers. "My father's tools," she said. "Have their own pegs," Cole said. "Always will." She turned the stone over once more, set it back on the rail. "Yes," she said. It was a simple word. She said it simply. His whole face changed. It didn't become dramatic or loud, it simply shifted into something quieter and better. The expression of a man who has been carrying tension in a held place so long he'd forgotten it was there until it left. He offered his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then placed hers in it. They shook hands, which seemed to amuse her deeply, And then she laughed, a real laugh, clean and sudden, and he found himself laughing too, which surprised him almost as much. They were married in June, on a Thursday, which was a practical day for a practical pair of people. The ceremony took place in front of the ranch house, the mountains at their backs, two of the ranch hands, and the circuit preacher in attendance. Nora wore a deep blue dress she'd made herself from fabric she'd chosen at the depot's dry goods counter, a small private satisfaction in that choice, and she carried her father's awl in her apron pocket, because she'd told Cole she wanted something of his with her, and that had seemed like the truest thing. Cole did not make a speech. He held her hand with the same firm, deliberate grip he'd used on the day of their engagement, and that said everything. Several years later, on a warm August evening, Cole came in from the west pasture to find Nora on the porch, her father's tool case open beside her, and a piece of bridle leather across her knees that she was working by the last of the daylight. A small girl with Cole's dark coloring and Nora's precise gray eyes was sitting on the step, watching her mother's hands with the same focused intensity her mother brought to everything. "Show me again," the girl said. Nora drew the needle through, slow and even. "You watch the tension," she said. "It has to be the same all the way through. Too tight and the leather pulls wrong. Too loose and it won't hold." She glanced at her daughter. "Feel it?" The girl nodded, gravely. Cole settled into the chair beside his wife. He picked up the scrap of leather she'd set aside and turned it over in his hands, the way he'd turned the harness over in his hands years ago in the depot, marveling at what good work looked like. "She's got your eye," he said. Nora looked up from her work and looked at their daughter, who had now taken a piece of scrap leather and was attempting, with great seriousness, to recreate the stitch. "She's got your stubbornness," she said. "She'll be at this until she gets it right." "She'll get it right," Cole said with certainty. They sat together as the summer light moved off the mountains, and the first stars appeared quiet, unhurried. The kind of contentment that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Some things are like that, the most enduring ones, usually. A life built not in a single moment of recognition, but in the 1,000 quiet choices that follow it. A workbench at the right height, a shelf built without a reason, a hand offered and taken. Being seen is rarely loud. It is the patient, steady act of paying attention to what a person does with their hands, to what they carry with them from a life before you knew them, to the small, persistent ways they show you who they are before they have decided whether to trust you with the words. Some people wait their whole lives to be seen that way. Some are lucky enough to be in the right room, on the right day, when someone looks up and asks the right question. The truest form of respect isn't always spoken. Sometimes it looks like a workbench built at exactly the right height, or a shelf put up without needing a reason. If someone in your life has been quietly doing excellent work while the room looks through them, you have a rare and simple power. Notice. Say so. That small act of recognition can change the entire shape of a person's life. A small note for you: this story was crafted and fictionalized by AI, offered to you for entertainment and the simple joy of a good tale, with the hope that the warmth at its heart finds its way into your day.